Scattered across the Irish countryside, strange circular formations interrupt the natural flow of the fields and forests. At first glance, they might look like nothing more than ancient ruins or curious bumps in the land, but to many, they are much more. These rings are steeped in history and fear. While archaeologists call them ringforts, from early medieval farmsteads, Ireland's folklore has given them another name: fairy forts. Over centuries, stories have taken root in the soil alongside these structures. Stories of spirits, curses, vanished people, and even scientific theories of forgotten plagues. What follows in this video is an exploration into why these mounds have inspired such enduring reverence, and why even today people are still afraid to touch them. Ringforts were ancient farmsteads, like a small private circular home where people lived with their families and animals, over hundreds and even thousands of years ago. Most were built between 500 and 1000 AD, during Ireland's medieval period, but some believe they date back even further. For example, in Lough, County Limerick, there is a stone circle that archaeologists believe to have dated from 3000 BC, meaning it stood there untampered with for 5000 years. These ancient Irish homes were very secure, with a wall around it to keep out wild animals, such as wolves, and to stop raiders from stealing farm animals and any other valuables. Cattle was the old currency of Ireland. Your status was determined on how many cows you owned, so naturally you built this defensive structure to protect them. They're almost always round. That was the easiest and strongest shape to build for a defensive structure, with limited tools and no cement. It was built up of a few wooden houses or huts. Before Christianity, Ireland's settlements and villages were purely just these ring-forted mounds. You had two main types: a rath, which was made of earth with ditches and raised banks, which were like kind of grassy ridges, and then wood was used to hold up the walls. And then there are cashels, made of stone, more common in the western areas of Ireland where it's rocky. Two well-preserved examples of these would be Rathcrogan, which is a site in County Roscommon, which has a cluster of ring-forted mounds, and Gronana Bhéalach in County Donegal, which is a well-preserved stone ring-forted mound. And as mentioned earlier, Lough in County Limerick, there is a Grange stone circle that archaeologists believe to date from 3000 BC. It is guarded by the white thorn tree, which in Irish folklore is a fairy tree, but we'll dive into that later in the video. First, we have to talk about what happened to them, and what their relation to Irish folklore actually is. Well, these ringforts stood strong for hundreds of years, and hosted generations of Irish families. These families were part of the native Irish clan system, often ruled by local chieftains. But Ireland began to go through sudden changes, with the induction of Christianity in the 5th century, and then in the 12th century when the Normans invaded. The Normans modernised Irish towns, with their castles and tower houses, and once they drove the Irish families off their newly claimed land, the ringforts began being abandoned. Nature began reclaiming the land. The wooden huts began to rot away, and all that remained was the circular ditches, banks, or stone walls, which looked mysterious and ancient. Over time, people began to forget who built the ringforts and what their purpose was. They fell deep into Irish folklore as people began to tell stories of their origins, and the one that stuck was that they were home to the fairies. This is why people also refer to them as fairy forts. Now, when I say fairy, I'm not talking about the Disney adaptation. Fairies in Irish folklore refer to spirits. The Irish word for fairy is sheohog, which is a derivative of she, as in the famous banshee, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, meaning woman of the she. The fairies themselves are called the Dinashi, meaning fairy people. As for what these beings are, folklore offers multiple theories. The rural peasantry often say they are fallen angels, spirits cast out of heaven for their lesser sins, not good enough to be saved, nor bad enough to be lost. Irish antiquarians, however, regard them as the old pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, diminished in stature after the coming of Christianity. Both views see fairies as in-between creatures. Famous author and poet W.B. Yeats describes them as, they can be benevolent or malevolent, depending on how they are treated, good to the good and evil to the evil. Yeats and other mystic writers suggest that beyond our visible world lies chain on chain of conscious beings, who have no inherent form but change according to their whim or the mind of those that see them. Fairies in Irish folklore are often broken down into two types: the sociable fairies and the solitary fairies. But who exactly are these spirits? First off is the sociable fairies, in large groups or communities, and often reveal themselves by dancing in troops. They mingle with or observe humans, but generally do not seek to harm unless provoked. The sheogues are called the little fairies, and they are trooping fairies of the land. They famously haunt certain trees and earth mounds, especially sacred thorn bushes, and the ancient earth forts, aka fairy forts. The relics of the Tua's dwellings, and are fiercely protected by the sheogues. Merrows are the fairies of the water, inhabiting the seas and deep lakes. The sight of a merrow is an omen of an approaching storm or rough seas, so sailors prefer these beings to remain unseen. Merrows are shapeshifters of the sea. In their more recognisable form, they appear as human from the torso up and fish-like from the waist down. The solitary fairies are those fairy beings who roam and act alone rather than in a troop, notably described as nearly all gloomy and terrible in some way. Unlike the trooping fairies, solitary fairies have a darker reputation. Many are pranksters, who delight in tricking and frightening humans. The most famous by far is the leprechaun. In Irish, the labrogan, the one shoemaker, the fairy cobbler, who earns his living by making shoes. He is notably the only industrious fairy, which perhaps is why trooping fairies wear out so many dancing shoes. The leprechaun is also known as secretive guardian of hidden treasure. Anyone lucky enough to catch him can force him to reveal his crock of gold, but if he so much as glance away, this willy creature vanishes in an instant, escaping with his riches. Folklore speculates on his origins. Some say he is the offspring of an evil spirit. In terms of dress, the leprechaun does not wear the modern cliché of all green. He wears a red coat, with 7 rows of buttons and a cocked hat. Another spirit is the fardarig, meaning red man, the prankster and nightmare. The fardarig is known as a practical joker of the fairy world. Among solitary fairies, the fardarig is grotesque and ill-mannered. This fairy has a connection to the dark dreams. One might wake from a nightmare and blame the fardarig for having crafted the fright. In demeanour, he is often depicted as cynical and crude, carrying out pranks to make humans feel ridiculous and afraid. For example, a fardarig might pretend to offer help, only to lead a person astray, or give someone a horrible scare just for his own amusement. Though not deadly, the fardarig's humour is often dark and unsettling, making him an unwelcome visitor. Up next, the Púca, the shape-shifting trickster. The Púca is amongst the most famous of Irish fairies, known for its wild shape-shifting antics. The Púca's favourite game is to find an unwearied traveller, often a drunkard, and take them on a terrifying wild ride. As a big dark horse with glowing eyes, the Púca will suddenly appear, allowing a drunken man to mount it, then gallop madly across the countryside, crashing through thickets, bounding over rivers and hills, until the rider is completely sobered and frightened. Come dawn's grey light, the Púca throws the rider off into a ditch or a mud puddle, and vanishes. It can appear in more bizarre forms as well. One famous tale from Kilkenny speaks of a Púca that haunted a fairy fort, in the form of a crawling, rolling fleece of wool. At night, would roll through the fields making a buzzing noise. That so terrified the farm animals that they ran to humans for protection. Whether as a formidable steed or an eerie ball of fluff, the Púca's aim is to cause complete chaos and fear. And finally we have the Dullahan, the headless coachman, perhaps the most dreadful of Irish solitary fairies. The Dullahan is a spectral headless being, who often appears as a black coach driver. Yeats describes this fairy as the most gruesome thing, a headless man who either carries his severed head under his arm, or simply has no head at all. The arrival of the Dullahan's coach is a terrifying omen. It only stops at a house of someone who is about to die. If you peek out your door when the death coach rattles by, a basin of blood may be thrown in your face as a warning. All locks and gates fly open to let the Dullahan pass, and no one can bar his way. As an omen of death, he has no interest in people's behaviours or offerings. He comes on his grim business regardless. He is the official herald of death, travelling with his phantom coach to collect souls. There was no real way to thwart the Dullahan. Even mentioning him is considered bad luck. And speaking of bad luck, take the case of Sean Quinn as an example. Once the richest man in Ireland, his business empire spanned from cement, insurance, hotels, you name it. But in the 1990s, Quinn made a fatal decision. He ordered the relocation of a 4,000-year-old megalithic tomb, a known fairy fort in County Cavan. Why? He needed more space for his expanding quarry. Not long after the fairy fort was moved, everything began to fall apart. His companies collapsed one after another. He lost his fortune. He filed for bankruptcy, and from being a billionaire to starting over from scratch. Coincidence? Maybe. But locals still whispered that the fairy fort wasn't meant to be disturbed. Now let's talk about one of the strangest links between ancient folklore and modern industry. The DeLorean car. The iconic gull-winged sports car, made famous by Back to the Future. In the early 1980s, John DeLorean, a former General Motors executive, set out to build a revolutionary affordable sports car. The idea was solid. The car looked futuristic. And then came the offer from the British government that would give him £100 million in funding as long as he built his factory in West Belfast, Northern Ireland. This was during the Troubles, a violent, politically charged conflict. The idea was to bring jobs to a war-torn area and maybe reduce IRA recruitment. DeLorean agreed and construction began. But here's where it gets strange. During the building of the factory, DeLorean bulldozed the fairy fort that stood in the way. Even members of the IRA reportedly warned him, saying, "Please don't touch that fort. Very bad things will happen." He ignored them. Within 3 years, the entire operation collapsed. Only 9,000 cars were ever made. DeLorean was caught in an FBI cocaine sting, trying to cover mounting debts. His dream fell apart, and he ended up in court, disgraced and broken. Was it just bad business, or was it something older and deeper, and angry? I mean, even the colonisers knew better. During British colonisation of Ireland, when Irish people were oppressed, the language outlawed, and traditions suppressed, there was only one thing that colonisers wouldn't touch: the fairy forts. Despite all their power and violence, they left those ancient mounds alone. Locals say it wasn't out of respect, but fear. Generations of Irish had warned them. Bad things will happen when you mess with the forts. And even the invaders knew better than to take the risk. These stories, whether rooted in folklore, cautionary tales, or just uncanny misfortune, show how deeply embedded fairy forts and sacred trees are in the Irish psyche. Whether you're a billionaire, a car engineer, or a coloniser, the lessons remain the same. Disturb the fairy places, and you invite misfortune. So you might be asking what the actual function of the fairy fort in Irish mythology is. Well, these are the homes of the ancient earth spirits. The Celts came to Ireland and fought the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Celts were destroying the land, so in order to keep the peace, the Tuatha decided to retreat to the underground, also known as the other world. There was a human world and a superhuman world, which exist in parallel, but occasionally there is a rift between the two worlds. They would appear to wreak vengeance when someone was messing with the land, or with their forts, which are the gateway to the underworld. It's said that when there is a mist or a fog around, spirits and fairies are making a trip in or out of the fairy fort nearby. White thorn or hawthorn is seen as a magical tree. The roots of the white thorn are known to reach into the other world. Now, not every single tree is protected by the fairies, but when it's on its own or it's in a field where it seems like it doesn't belong, that's when you know it's a tree of the fairies. But stepping back from the myths and legends for a moment, what made the whitethorn tree so sacred to our Irish ancestors? Yes, it's native to the land, and yes, its white blossoms stand out, but there may also be deeper, more practical reasons for its reserved status, especially from a biodiversity perspective. The whitethorn or the hawthorn blooms in April and May, right after winter, when almost nothing else is flowering. At this crucial time, the queen bee emerges, hungry and ready to establish their hives. And what's blooming? The whitethorn. It's their first food source of the year. Once fed, the queen bee builds her hive, and the summer-long cycle of pollination begins. Bees spread pollen, plants grow, crops thrive, life flourishes. Without the whitethorn, that entire chain might break. So imagine you're living in ancient Ireland. You might not know about pollination in scientific terms, but you see the pattern. Where the whitethorn grows, the land is abundant. It becomes the giving tree, the silent guardian to life's renewal. Naturally, you'd want to protect it. But how do you make sure no one cuts it down? You tell stories. You say spirits live in it, fairies guard it. Disturb the tree and misfortune will follow. And suddenly, the whitethorn is off limits. Not just by law or custom, but by fear. A sacred boundary is created, passed down through generations. But there's another layer to its mystique, one rooted in sorrow. During the Great Famine, whitethorn trees were sometimes planted to mark mass graves. These were no ordinary burials, but hurried, unmarked pits where hundreds of men, women, and children were laid to rest. The white thorn became their tombstone. In that context, the tree doesn't just symbolise life and protection, it represents death, memory, and respect. Disturbing such a tree meant disturbing its eternal rest of those buried beneath it. No wonder people felt eerie and almost spiritual energy around it. So between being the vital part of nature's rebirth and the solemn marker of tragic loss, the white thorn tree earned its place in Irish folklore. Not just as a mystical symbol, but also something deeply rooted in the land, the people, and their survival. And in relation to the ringfort theory, I was listening to the Blind Boy podcast when I came across this incredible theory by Patrick McCaffrey about how ancient ringforts in Ireland may have become known as fairy forts. These beliefs stretch back to hundreds, possibly even thousands of years ago, long before writing existed in Ireland. Originally, ringforts were practical structures that housed families, but over time nature took over. The wood rotted, the earth collapsed, and all that remained were strange circular mounds, often with scattered stones dotting the landscape. As generations passed, people forgot what these mounds were or who built them. Gerald of Wales, who visited Ireland in the 12th century, wrote about it in his book, Topographia Hibernica. Something, as he said, had driven the Irish people out of them. And what's McCaffrey's theory? Anthrax. Anthrax is a deadly, naturally occurring bacteria that can survive in soil for centuries. It's rare today, but it used to be one of the most terrifying killers. It mainly infected animals like cattle, but if humans come into contact with infected livestock, it can spread rapidly and kill entire communities, sometimes in just a week. Now imagine this, 1,000 years ago, a ringfort full of people and livestock. One cow gets infected, then another. Soon the whole herd dies. Then the people start dying too. Nobody knows why. It's before germ theory, before modern medicine. The entire family inside the ringfort perishes. Centuries later, all that's left is the circular mound. The wood is gone, the bodies are gone. Only stones and earth remains. A new group stumbles upon it and decides to use the stones for buildings. They start digging, but anthrax spores, which had lain dormant in the soil for hundreds of years, are released. The bacteria infects the new group. Another outbreak begins. Another village is wiped out. Eventually, nearby communities notice the pattern. Every time someone disturbs these strange mounds, people die. So they start marking them. Maybe they plant a white thorn tree as a warning sign. Stay away. Could this have happened multiple times over centuries? Before people understood bacteria or disease, all they knew was this: disturb a ringfort and people die. That's why McCaffrey believes ringforts became feared and wrapped in superstition, and it's also why they're still avoided today. It's important to note that no scientist has tested ringfort sites for anthrax. This just remains a theory, but it's a chilling one, and it makes you look at these old, overgrown mounds in a very different way. Conclusion: Ireland's landscape is more than just hills and hedges. It's layered with memory. Beneath the grass and stones lie the remnants of ancient lives, mysterious deaths, and generations of whispered warnings. What began as practical family homesteads, ringforts built to protect people, livestock, and livelihoods, were eventually reclaimed by nature, forgotten by time, and reborn in story. Some say they are the homes of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Others say they are burial grounds of famine victims. Scientists speculate about bacteria. Folklorists speak of spirits. Locals just say, leave them alone. And maybe that's the point. Whether through fear of fairies, respect for the dead, or quiet awe at what we don't fully understand, these sites have been protected in a way no law could ever enforce. It's easy to dismiss folklore and fantasy, but stories, like the land, carry truth. They are warnings. They are wisdom disguised as wonder. And they remind us of a world where lines between nature and myth, science and spirit, were never sharply drawn. So next time you see a lone whitethorn tree in the middle of a field, or a strange, perfect ring in the grass from above, pause, step back, and remember, whether it's biology, belief, or both, some places are meant to be left untouched.
you.